When the apocalypse began, most people were convinced that it was God's punishment. They believed that God had simply forgotten about them and wanted to mock them. Or perhaps it was a punishment for all living people, or an incredibly difficult test of strength that everyone who wanted to stay alive had to go through. People had to fight for survival and literally kill each other. But one day there was an explosion, and then another, and many more. From that time on, people no longer appeared as creators of life. They were no longer at the top of the food chain. The only thing they could do was just fight for their lives, and the only chance to escape was the ship. Those who were not lucky enough to get to it simply died. They were ready to kill each other for the right to get on the ship and stay alive. And those who did not manage to do this were doomed to a cruel death. People were no longer masters of their land. The only chance to survive and all the hope they had was on the ship. When it was completely gone, they had no other choice. They had to eat the remains of dead animals, which also became victims of the apocalypse. The main character, who was able to get on the ship, tried to do everything for the survival of his own family. He suffered terrible wounds that were on his body. In addition, he had to remember his enemies, who were always there, and were ready to strike at any moment. The ship set sail on a sea of blood because everything living on Earth had died. The last time people ate was more than 5 days ago. They had absolutely nothing, even water they tried to save. Everyone had a weapon and was ready to fight at any moment. After all, people were ready to eat each other because of hunger. Not long before that, no one could even think that such a catastrophe could happen. The main character was sitting at home with his son. The father loved his son and could never have thought that in the future he would have to fight for his life. His daughter was a teenager and studied in college. Roberto Hoffman himself. In the past, he was a military man and served in special forces. However, such a brutal man loved his daughter Jessie and did everything for her, what she wanted. His wife Jessie was very attractive and they loved each other. She told that something incomprehensible started to happen in the city, and it was at this moment when the explosion happened. The man rushed to the window, but to check what really happened. But what he saw shocked even him, an experienced military man who had seen a lot in his life. A real house was being built on the street, people were killing each other, and there was a lot of blood. Downstairs, just by the front door, people were attacking each other and biting each other's throats. Suddenly, the little boy saw familiar people on the street. He shouted in order to say hello to them. However, the little boy did not understand that his friend from kindergarten was actually dead and would never recognize him again. The man could not believe his eyes and tried to understand what was happening. He saw terrible wounds on the bodies of people and did not understand how she stayed on her feet and stayed alive. Suddenly, the woman's head fell off, and the children became witnesses of this terrible picture. They started screaming, and their father covered the children's eyes so that they would not see it again. Because the children started screaming, the terrible creatures heard them and started moving in their direction. The man understood that now, they needed to escape and leave the house as soon as possible. However, he understood that something was wrong with his wife, because she started biting his hand. He couldn't believe his own eyes. Was she really infected now? For a while, he couldn't believe that this had really happened and did nothing. But Jesse didn't stop and continued to tear his flesh. Now, the man realized that his entire family was in danger and his beloved wife could no longer be saved. He had to act very quickly because the mutants continued to approach their house. His children didn't even notice that something was wrong with their mother. The man tried to endure it because he didn't want them to witness this terrible picture. But still, he couldn't endure it anymore and ordered the girl to take her son to the garage. When the little one saw his own mother, his eyes filled with tears. He wanted to be with her and couldn't believe that she was no longer human. His father didn't want him to witness such a terrible scene because he understood that it could affect his whole life. Therefore, he shouted to Ara and ordered her to quickly take her little brother. But she did not want to go without her own father, and suddenly she realized what had really happened. Because she saw her mother, who could no longer control herself and was not a living person. She continued to tear the man's hand into pieces, and Roberto Hoffman could not stand the pain and began to scream. Her mouth and teeth were covered in blood. She continued to chew the meat from his hand. The soldier tried to hold on, because he did not want to scare his children even more. But in the end, he ordered them to run away, and he himself was going to finish off the mutant who was in his house and now threatened his children. But unexpectedly, the zombie was very strong. Even though he was a skilled soldier and had completed combat training, it was not easy for him. He had to retreat because she almost bit him on the neck. The man hoped that the woman could be saved. When he saw the wounds on her body, he realized that this was not the case. In addition, she tried to bite him again. Therefore, he had to cover himself with his own hand. He had a gun, but he did not want to do it. After all, even though she was a zombie, he loved her. However, he simply had no other choice and shot her exactly in the head. Tears appeared in his eyes. He tried to hold on, but he couldn't stand it and just cried. Roberto Hoffman hugged the body of his wife, who was dead. He started screaming because he didn't understand how all this could happen. But suddenly he realized that she wasn't dead. She seemed to be fighting the disease and trying to say something. Roberto Hoffman started screaming at her and hoped that she would be able to say something. At that moment, she looked up and looked straight at him. She remembered the man she loved and was able to regain consciousness for a while. She said that she really loved him, but she couldn't stand it anymore. And suddenly another shot rang out and she shot herself in the head. Her blood got on his face. At that moment, a series of incomprehensible explosions rang out on the street. One of them was so powerful that it created a blast wave that destroyed everything in its path. Roberto Hoffman tried to leave the city with his children, but the mutants began to pursue him. A lot of people were in mortal danger and simply died, not having time to escape. Roberto Hoffman looked at his wounded hand and hoped that he would not get infected. It is surprising, because he managed to hold out for so long, the infection has not yet reached his body. A lot of people began to push each other in order to get out of the deadly trap. Ahead was a high wall that was supposed to save part of the city from the invasion of the dead. The man understood that he had to get there first, at least to save his own children. His son ended up on the other side, where it was safer. His daughter Era followed him, who simply jumped to the other side. But in reality, the woman who wanted to help had other intentions. Roberto Hoffman understood this from the very beginning and tried to get his son back. But it was too late, because the unknown woman started running away with his son. His sister tried to fix everything, but could not break through the huge crowd of people. He was the only one who tried to fight and did everything to break through. Suddenly, he noticed his son, who had lost consciousness. After some time, he managed to catch up with his daughter, who was crying and asking for his forgiveness. The exhausted man simply fell to the ground and began to cry, because he had lost so much that day. Now he had only his daughter left, whom he could not lose. The next morning, the man tried to examine his wounds and injured hand. He noticed that it was very swollen and painful. The veins and vessels on his hands were swollen and very large. He could not even move them without pain. He understood that he was turning into a zombie, but it happened very slowly. But this pain was nothing compared to what he felt after losing his own son. He had no right to die or turn into a monster until he found his son and the woman who exposed him. He devoted his last months to his search, killing on his way a huge number of mutants and other living people who interfered with him. And he never once felt sorry for anyone and tried to do everything in his power. His daughter was always there for him and tried to help. But she felt a huge guilt because now her brother was not with him. There were moments when she wanted to give up and die. And Roberto Hoffman simply could not allow this and lose her too. The girl often cried and asked him for forgiveness every day because of what happened. However, the man tried to calm her down and said that he should have been more careful to watch over them both. And it was he who needed to ask for forgiveness because of the situation they were in now. Every day was the same, and for a long time, he almost managed to overcome the terrible pain. Also, he managed to teach the girl everything he knew. And now, she was good at weapons and could help him in real gunfights. In fact, she was not his own daughter. She came into his family when she was only 7 years old, and he was the one who raised her. Ara felt unnecessary in his family. She was often sad and depressed. But the man tried to do everything possible to make her feel like a family in his house. And he swore that he would always protect her until his death. And she would be able to get out of the ship and start a new life in a safe place. Once on the ship, he had new allies. Also, the man realized that the mutants only reacted to noise and any sound could attract their attention. All the people on the ship had problems with food, so they had to search for it and risk their own lives for it. Next to them was the biology professor Adam Smith, who believed that all the food should be divided in half. However, the hungry Musamoto did not listen to him and wanted to take most of the food for himself. This man did not understand that because of him everyone could die, so the leader ordered him to shut up. They started arguing and Musamoto replied that he was not going to listen to him. At that moment, a mutant attacked him, grabbed his head, and bit off his head. Everyone saw that the man had died and realized that now they were in danger. Despite the hostility, Roberto Hoffman tried to save him and rushed forward. He cut the monster in half with his sword and pushed him aside, away from the man, because I hope he could still be alive. The mutant remained alive, so he gathered his strength and dealt a decisive blow. With his bare hands, he killed him, crushing his head. He did this with incredible strength and cruelty, because every time he remembered his own son, whom he still could not find. The girl had long been accustomed to his cruelty and treated it calmly, but the others understood that it was better not to mess with him because he was the strongest of them all. Meanwhile, they looked at the poor man, who remained alive but was defeated. He had been very strong before and would soon turn into a zombie. It was no longer possible to save him, so the only thing left to do was to put him out of his misery. Therefore, with one strong movement, Roberto Hoffman struck him directly in the neck and cut off his head. Suddenly, something happened that no one expected. Ara threatened the old man with a weapon and waited for orders from her adoptive father. And then, he ordered to open fire. At that very moment, she fired a shot at the zombie who was behind the professor. The old man had already said goodbye to life because he thought that he had been betrayed and simply used. But it wasn't like that. The girl was just trying to protect him and kill those who were approaching. She was very skilled with weapons and killed everyone who approached her. After some time, the sewer was completely cleared and all the zombies were dead. But the sounds of shots would attract the attention of new monsters, so they had to escape from here. Suddenly, a terrible noise was heard on the ship. Everyone realized that it was time for lunch because they managed to catch prey. They began to climb to the surface and realized that a lot of people had gathered at the gate. There, they began to open. It had been a long time since any of them had gone out on deck. They immediately smelled fresh air, and this moment was remembered by all of them. He came to the surface first, his daughter was standing next to him, and they wanted to see with their own eyes what had happened. In front of them was a giant zombie whale that had been dead for a long time. Its meat began to decompose, but for hungry people it could become a real delicacy. And they could not wait to taste real meat. Approaching him, Roberto Hoffman saw hunters who were hunting him. One of them was a woman in a suit who immediately caught his attention. The big black man was immediately happy when he saw the daughter of the main character because she was quite attractive. Roberto Hoffman approached him and told her to stay behind. He threatened him with reprisals for such words. And he prepared for battle and was ready to kill him. To avoid a fight, a woman in a suit intervened in the conversation and asked for forgiveness for her friend's words. They met eyes and looked at each other for a long time. In the end, the main character, without answering anything, agreed to retreat, and he ordered all his people to retreat, and he himself headed towards the whale. He was going to cut open its stomach, which began to swell with gases, and so that it did not explode, it had to be done quickly. These people who were watching this understood that an explosion would soon occur and an incredible stench would be felt by all the people on the ship. As soon as he told his stomach, it burst, and the blood and stench from his body flew to all the people standing nearby. At that moment, the Negro realized that Roberto Hoffman was really capable of something and knew how to handle weapons. At that moment, David had to check if his meat could be eaten and if it was safe. But because of the stench, he did not want to do it, so Roberto Hoffman had to force him. Everyone was waiting impatiently for him to give his verdict. However, from his reaction, they realized that most likely it was spoiled. But after a while, he smiled and replied that today they would have a very delicious dinner. People rushed to the dead whale and were going to cut off a piece of meat for themselves. However, the main character was in no hurry to do this. He carefully examined its internal organs, and he realized that something was wrong with them. He ordered everyone to step back, sensing a hidden danger. After all, he realized that the whale could still be alive. At that very moment, its mouth opened. He bit the man in half, and he didn't even have time to react and hide. In addition, a huge number of zombies began to crawl out of his body to the surface. This cat was a cannibal, so now they were inside it. He had never seen this before and could not believe that this could really happen. In addition, there were a lot of mutants, and now they would have to fight him. People were defenseless. Panic began, and they tried to save their own lives. The girl noticed that the zombies looked very strange, which meant that something was wrong with them. There were a lot of them, so they had to retreat because they had no chance of winning. But something happened that no one expected. Because the people who were inside closed the gate, and now most of them were in a death trap. There were a lot of people on the deck who would now have to fight for their lives. Roberto Hoffman understood that they had no chance. Most of the people even had a lot of weapons, so they were doomed to death. Last, he tried to open the door, but the people inside held them with their own bodies and did not allow him to do so. Roberto Hoffman began to get angry and promised to kill all the people who had done such a vile act. There was no other option left now. They would have to fight. He tried to negotiate with the people one last time, but they did not listen to him. They just wanted to survive and promised to open the door after he killed the zombies on the surface. They did not care even if they all died. Meanwhile, the mutants had already begun to attack the people. Most of them could not even defend themselves. Therefore, they died immediately, without even trying to resist. And those who saw all this with their own eyes began to panic and begged to open the gate. The infected turned into mutants and zombies became more and more numerous. And to get inside, they tried to break the window. And it was through them that they tried to get inside. But the people inside did not want to allow this, so they were going to open fire, one after another. Many shots rang out. Those who tried to get inside through the windows died. I want it. No one else tried to get inside. And Roberto Hoffman understood that they simply had no other option, so they had to fight. People from the inside began to threaten that they would kill everyone who would try to climb through the window. Time was running out, so the girl showed that it was necessary to fight. The main character ordered all the people to stand behind him because they would fight to the death. These zombies were special because they could run and had incredibly sharp and strong teeth. One of them began to bite the man's hand. His grip was very strong and it seemed that he could tear his hand off. Roberto Hoffman tried to push him away, but the mutant was so strong that even he could not defeat him. Therefore, in order to tear him off his hand, he delivered a strong blow with his knee. Monster let go of him, but tore off a huge piece of flesh from his hand, from unbearable pain when he began to scream. But this was not the end, because the monsters remained alive and were preparing to continue attacking people. Hearing the smell of blood, they only became more aggressive and began to run towards people. They accelerated everything so quickly that now, people began to panic. The girl opened fire, but it didn't stop the mutant. A piece of meat simply flew away from him, but he still remained alive and continued to run straight at her. The peculiarity of these mutants was that they had blood and other fluids inside them, like a living person. No one had ever seen such strong mutants as these before. It seemed that these were figures that could not be stopped. And they all rushed to attack, just at people who were defenseless. The man managed to dodge the blow of the first. He stopped his attack and grabbed the monster by the arm, not letting himself be hit. With one sharp and strong blow, he cut off his arm with his own sword. But before he could relax, another zombie started attacking him from behind. In order to stop him, he had to fight back with his elbow. The blow was strong, right in the head. However, this was not enough, because in front of him was a real army of mutants who were hungry and intended to tear people apart. He tried to cut off his head, because he knew that this was perhaps the only way to stop them. But he quickly realized that he had made a big mistake. The skin of these zombies was very elastic, and it was not so easy to cut, so it had no effect. Now he found himself completely surrounded. Hungry mutants were attacking him from all sides. His daughter was next to him and helped fight as best she could. However, she also realized that they would not have enough strength to defeat an entire army on their own, because the bullets were running out and her weapon was not effective. One of the mutants began to approach, but Roberto Hoffman had a gun. He was going to use it and aimed directly at the zombie's face. The man was left without a weapon because his sword remained in his neck and Roberto Hoffman simply could not get it. Even after a direct hit to the head, nothing changed, because even a large hole in his head did not stop him. The mutant was alive and tried to tear him to pieces. The girl opened fire on the zombie. Many people died because they could not stop them. The zombie's head was completely crushed. Almost an entire store had to be spent on it. And only then did he stop resisting and calm down. And only then did he realize that he was dead. Roberto Hoffman realized that in order to kill him, several shots were needed directly to the head. However, this was not enough. Killing one mutant would not stop an entire army that began to approach. Now the man tried to aim for the head because he needed to save ammunition. The girl did the same because she realized that these mutants were not as simple as those they had fought before. And when they were alone, they opened fire, trying to shoot directly to the head. This gave results because many mutants were destroyed. Roberto Hoffman entered into close combat with them in order to protect his girl and prevent the zombies from reaching her. And she stood behind him and tried to cover him from behind. Roberto Hoffman tried to hold on and not panic. However, he understood that the bullets were running out. In addition, there were a lot of mutants, and he and his own daughter would definitely not be able to stop them. A whole wave of zombies attacked him, and he found himself right under them, buried alive. But even being completely surrounded, he did not give up, and continued to fight, repelling all the mutants' attacks. The girl could not believe that this was the end, and now her father had no chance of salvation. However, her situation was no better, because the wave of mutants had already reached her. They pounced on her. Roberto Hoffman started screaming and tried to break through to get to the girl and try to save her. However, it was very difficult to do this. He had to throw the mutants with his bare hands that were in his way. Meanwhile, other people just watched what was happening. They did not interfere and were not going to help. The fat man was satisfied because now his direct competitor was dead. Ara also did not give up and tried to free herself from her deadly captivity. A woman in a mask was watching what was happening, and it seemed that she felt sorry for the child, who was so helpless at that moment. The man just looked at them and started screaming. He did not understand why they did not help, and would they really let them die such a terrible death? The others simply looked at what was happening with horror, but they did not even think of opening the door and saving their neighbors on the ship. Roberto Hoffman understood that this was the end. He had no chance to free himself and escape. Before his eyes, his daughter lost consciousness, and the zombies began to tear her to pieces. Roberto Hoffman was experiencing an incredible shock and understood that something was happening to his body. His eyes turned black, blood flowed from his mouth, and the blood vessels on his skin became large and swollen. And suddenly, an explosion. The woman realized that something had happened that none of them could have expected, because the mutants who surrounded the people began to die one by one. They literally flew into pieces, and Roberto Hoffman turned into a real monster. After that bite, he was no longer an ordinary person, and only in such a stressful situation he managed to release his power. His hand became a real weapon for him. His eyes were bloodshot. This man, who was no longer human, only wanted death and would not stop until he killed everyone. Watching him, the woman was shocked, but she tried her best not to show it. While the fat man could barely contain his surprise, it seemed that he even became scared. And the people who were watching him felt fear and understood that they would not be able to hide from him. Meanwhile, Roberto Hoffman moved through the mountain of dead bodies. He continued to kill everyone in his path with his hand, which looked like a crab claw. He simply impaled the mutants, like on a skewer, and their dead bodies lay around him. The zombies that approached him flew into pieces in different directions. They were no longer a threat to him, and the man began to feel confident. However, he did not forget about his own daughter, who needed his help. He simply hoped that she was still alive and he still had a chance to save her. The woman who was watching him realized that she was not mistaken, because from the very beginning she suspected that Roberto Hoffman was not an ordinary man. At that moment, he was going to avenge his own daughter and rush to attack the new wave of mutants. He easily managed to defeat them, and the dead bodies of the zombies lay on the ground. Suddenly, he struck a strong blow. From this, all the mutants shuddered. Even the people who were on the ship lost their balance and fell off their feet. A blast wave was formed from which all the mutants flew in different directions. Even the sea became restless, and within a radius of several hundred meters, high waves rose. In this noise and commotion, he saw Ara, who flew into the air. He reacted instantly and rushed to the girl in order to save her. A few seconds later, Ara was in his arms. The man tried to bring her to consciousness and bent over her body, but all efforts were in vain because the girl did not react and did not wake up. From the pain of loss, he began to scream in a non-human voice and promised to take revenge and destroy everyone who was involved in her death. And the first on his list were people who just stood on the sidelines and did nothing. The Negro realized that now he was a real threat to him. And the girl realized that he was a zombie, but only half, because despite the mutation, he still had consciousness. The man scattered the mutants who were still alive and different sides and held the girl's body in his arms. Now, he managed to get to the metal wall of the ship, behind which the cowards were hiding. Roberto Hoffman grabbed the metal and tried to break the strong metal. From his pressure, the metal began to bend. With one hand, he moved a huge container to another place. On the container above stood his enemies, whom he was trying to reach. Now, with its help, he was going to destroy the mutants who were approaching him. The container became a huge roller that crushed the mutants who were in its path. Their bodies began to fall overboard. Now, the deck became clear. He was able to destroy them single-handedly. The container, along with them, began to fall into the water. Hundreds of mutants who were still alive ended up in the water. They began to sink, and the water turned red from their blood and bodies. When it was all over, Roberto Hoffman looked at his own hand and did not understand what had happened to him. However, the other mutants who were on the deck were still alive and were going to continue the attack. The enemies began to approach him. They looked at the man and were amazed by his abilities because they had never seen anything like him before. Now there was a piece of the monster in him, and his hand seemed very sweet to them. However, Roberto Hoffman did not react. He was holding his own daughter in his arms and could not believe that this was the end. It hurt him to look at her helpless dead body, which had mutant bites and deep wounds on it. Carefully, he put her on the deck and did not leave for some time. He carefully touched her legs, his hands trembling. The man began to cry and hoped that after all, she would be able to wake up and recover. Now he stood in front of his enemies and tried to understand who they really were, but he knew for sure that they were not his allies and were not going to put up with him. Meanwhile, frightened people began to go out onto the deck after everything was over. The man did not care who was in front of him. He was already tired of dealing with everything, and now he knew for sure that everyone who was not close to him was his enemy. The woman in the mask agreed with him because it was very simple and reasonable. Suddenly, she approached him so quickly that the man did not have time to understand anything. When she was a meter away from him, she kicked him hard in the chest. His breathing stopped. He definitely didn't expect this and wasn't ready for such a strong and sudden blow. But these were the rules of survival in hell. No one had allies. Everyone had to think only of themselves. The woman saw his emotions and decided to take advantage of this because after losing his daughter, he was vulnerable. Roberto Hoffman couldn't come to his senses after the blow. The woman continued to press directly on his deep wound in his stomach. From the intense pain, his eyes darkened and he began to lose consciousness. It seemed that the main character lost consciousness and she, together with Kuchak, decided to move on. And the main character and his daughter, who were unconscious, they dragged after them. After the battle with the mutants, the ship calmly sailed on. The sea became calm. Having found a safe and remote cabin, the enemies began to equip it. In the center stood a table, to which they tied the main character. While he was in a blackout, Kuchak was going to cut off his hand with a chainsaw. He noticed that everything was fine with the man, while his hand began to enlarge and pulse. The gang did not know what was best to do with him, but there was only one solution. They were convinced that sooner or later, the hero would become a mutant completely and the virus would absorb his brain. Suddenly, Roberto Hoffman came to his senses and opened his eyes. Everyone was very surprised when they saw him alive. It was necessary to hurry until he came to his senses completely and began to resist. Therefore, the fat man raised his heavy saw and was about to cut off his mutated hand. But suddenly, the main character opened his eyes completely and began to look around the room and what was around him. He did not understand anything at all and did not know what was happening and why these people were holding him by force. Two held him while the big man tried to cut off part of his body, trying to deprive him of the weapon that was in his body. Suddenly, the main character began to rise and tried to free himself. He remembered what had happened to him before that, and how meanly he was hit in the stomach, and that in reality, the people around him were his enemies. Now he knew exactly what he had to do. He had to free himself and find his daughter. The man tried to break free when suddenly he felt a strong and sharp pain in his hand. Turning around, he saw Kuchak trying to cut it off. And suddenly, he saw how right before his eyes, the hand began to shrink. And gradually, it came to its normal size. The man tried to hold him, when suddenly, a girl appeared who was not delighted with what was happening. It seemed to her that it was just a waste of time, and what they were doing would not give any result. Seeing her, Kuchak simply froze in place, because he did not expect her to appear in such a place. Another curly-haired worker also did not expect to see Kaimaru here, because she was their boss and rarely appeared in such places. All four looked at her, and it seemed that time had simply stopped. They all stopped. Kaimaru began to speak to the captive and told him that he had been unconscious for 3 days. In addition, Ara was alive, and if he wanted to see her, he should follow the woman. Despite his surprise, the boss ordered him to be untied and allowed to follow her. They were stunned by such a decision, however, they could not argue with her and did everything as she ordered. Roberto Hoffman freed himself and looked at his hand. It was normal, and he couldn't believe that a few minutes ago, it was not in such a state at all. They moved the ship and approached one of the rooms, the door of which was closed. As it turned out, there were a lot of people inside, and they were all scared when they saw the main character alive. Finally, they had food, which they prepared from whale meat. Although it was not tasty and very dangerous, many people were dying of hunger, and they simply had no other choice. Kaimaru was going to give him a piece of meat that belonged to him, so he cut his meat. They entered the room where there was a lot of meat. In addition, on the bed, in the middle of the room, he saw his own daughter, who was lying on the bed and seemed to be breathing. Next to her was Adam Smith, who did not leave her and watched over her recovery. He was not even afraid that there was a chance of infection and she could turn into a zombie. Roberto Hoffman rushed to her and could not believe that she could be alive. Her body was in wounds that were treated and bandaged. People tried to do everything possible for her to recover and treated her wounds. The girl was breathing, and everyone was convinced that she was about to wake up. Finally, the main character calmed down because hope had appeared again. Roberto Hoffman hugged her and was glad that she was alive. But it was too early to rejoice because now she was just like him, half a zombie. The man could not believe it and asked if they were telling him the truth. Roberto Hoffman still could not come to his senses after what he had heard and come to his senses. The old professor could not believe it either. In addition, the doctors noticed that her recovery abilities were very unusual. The wounds healed very quickly. Roberto Hoffman looked at her and hoped that she would soon come to her senses, talk to him, and everything would be fine with her. It was also strange that she did not turn into a zombie immediately after being bitten. Therefore, most likely, she should become the same monster as him. Moreover, it seemed to the doctors that she had been like that from the very beginning, even before she got on the ship. The torn wounds on her body healed very quickly by themselves. One could even say that she had the ability to regenerate and restore herself without any medicine. None of them had ever seen anything like this before, so this girl was unique. And it was important to save her life in order to see what would happen to her body next. Roberto Hoffman was still thinking about what he had heard. He could not believe that she could turn into a monster like himself. However, these were not all assumptions. The woman thought that all the people on this ship could have such abilities. Suddenly, he heard the voice of a little boy who was leaning against his father. the hero turned to check what was happening behind him. It was the son of Kuchak, who did not consider him such a monster and saw in him only a protector. However, he still had many questions for the leader of the ship. Why did she decide to help him? Because it seemed that she wanted him dead and even tried to kill him. However, she explained that this was not the case because they helped him and all the time made sure that he survived. She told about the real owner of this ship, who was a one-eyed man with white hair, Kazel Tutmos. It seemed that the main character knew his name because when he heard about him, he got angry and immediately started screaming. This person was very famous, and everyone who was on the ship must have heard about him at least once in their life. Moreover, Roberto Hoffman was a military man, so he must have known him. Therefore, she was not even going to tell him what the reason was, in order not to waste time. At this moment, he became serious, because he understood that everything was not at all as he had thought from the very beginning. They all knew the old man, and knew about his cruelty and attitude towards people. It was he who initiated the project on the national defense strategy, and it was he who presented it to the crowd. Since the emergence of humanity, there had not been a single peaceful day, and right now, the whole world was on the verge of extinction. Therefore, the troops were sent to hotspots where wars were taking place. These spots were all over the world. This decision could kill a lot of innocent people who would not even die for their country. Moreover, it will not do anything because wars around the world will never be stopped by one leader, especially when no one else is committed to peace and is ready to fight to the very end. He tried to convince women that their husbands should have given their lives for the country. This was real propaganda. The task of this madman is to convince people that there is nothing terrible in death. He called on people to violence and said that this was the only way so that in the future, their children would not know the word war. And now they simply could not ignore it. And the man was convinced that if this was not done now, then in a few years, the world would be destroyed. He spoke of the pain, blood, and tears that his soldiers felt, and from this, most of the people began to cry. Behind him stood soldiers who, according to him, were no longer human. And in order to prove it, he put a gun to the head of one of them and was ready to shoot. People simply could not believe their own eyes. Could it be that an innocent soldier would be killed right before their eyes? But in fact, these soldiers were not living creatures. They were ordinary pieces of protein that were grown in laboratories. And at this moment, he suddenly fired a shot right in the soldier's head. People froze with horror in their eyes and watched what would happen next. A deep dent remained on his head, but the soldier remained alive. The leader convinced the people that he did not even feel anything, and that this shot did not kill him. The people were horrified because they could not believe what had happened. These soldiers had no morality and no other feelings. They could not even feel pain and were not afraid of dying. These soldiers were a tool. It was a weapon with which a man was going to take over the whole world and subjugate humanity. And this was his main trump card, which was supposed to protect the people of the country from wars and the death of ordinary people. However, other influential leaders believed that his idea was crazy and did not agree that robots could replace people. They simply could not compensate for the thousands of lives that had already been lost during the wars. However, they could try to prevent this from happening again. And if everything works out, people will no longer have to die. His idea is to become a great power that is able to defend itself and destroy the word war forever. People began to applaud. They believed him and were convinced that now their men would not have to die. And the soldiers continued to stand silently. It seemed that they really did not feel anything. After the presentation, the production of robots became massive. The project to launch biomachines became successful, and now many military companies tried to develop these robots in-house. However, this was only the beginning, and the experiments would not end there. The leaders were going to continue experiments in order to invent new, even more dangerous weapons. The soldiers they created looked like ordinary dolls made of wood. They had no feelings and emotions compared to the ordinary people they replaced. However, despite such a grandiose success, there was one very serious mistake in the development, about which they did not tell ordinary people. Many soldiers began to suffer from unknown diseases and fell right before their eyes. Among them were even robots that fell to the ground during ordinary training. No one understood why this was happening. Therefore, before sending the robots on a real mission, they were thoroughly checked. All of them had to undergo a mandatory inspection. And those who aroused suspicion and did not look very good risked being destroyed and sent back. The main character checked such soldiers. Robots. This was his job as a soldier. After the inspection, he took off his helmet, not considering that the robots could have an unknown disease. His employees were frightened by his behavior and warned that it could be dangerous. However, he was convinced that it was safe to be around the robot because he did not notice any signs of illness in him. He even praised the robot for doing his job well and now suggested that he go and rest. Although the robot did not feel emotions, The man believed that it was something much more than just pieces of metal. Therefore, he allowed the model to enter the bus and ride along with everyone else. The robot entered. However, its inspection did not end there. There were many other robots inside, over which the military stood and monitored order. When everything was ready, the bus, together with the soldiers, set off and left the bunker. The main character watched the bus with his eyes. It seemed that he was very thoughtful, and something was scaring him very much. However, no one except him expressed any concern. The man could not stop thinking about the new robots because he did not know where they were being sent or what would happen next. Hearing his words, the commander stopped abruptly because he did not think that anyone could be interested in their fate. The protagonist also noticed that the sick robots never returned to the unit and simply disappeared. However, the man cut him off in a harsh tone and warned him that he should not meddle in his own affairs because it was none of his business. In addition, the robots were ordinary test subjects and no one valued their lives. They had never been alive from the very beginning. In addition, the leader was convinced that their lives meant nothing, and by destroying them, they were only saving a large number of people. Roberto Hoffman realized what this could really mean. The robots were simply killed, regardless of anything. This meant that the soldiers and children used in training were simply under experiments, on which experiments were conducted. And it was thanks to books that it was possible to teach the intelligence of robots to machines that imitated all the skills of a person. For a long time, he observed the robots and concluded that they had formed their own intelligence and abilities. They could develop independently of each other and gradually only developed. And this meant that by killing them, they were no different from murderers, because they also kill something living. The leader got angry. Although it sounded very cruel, he was convinced that this was the only way to save people. He did not want to talk about it anymore, because he felt that he simply had no arguments left. In addition, they considered the term murderer inappropriate because real murderers only killed living beings, and these were robots. They treated the robots very cruelly. They were ready to kill them at any moment. It seemed that some of them could really feel some emotions because their appearance was very sad. There was a room ahead, and everyone knew that none of the robots could return from there alive. Inside, there were cameras. Every step of the robots was watched by guards who made sure that no one got out alive. The mustachioed uncle was in charge and carefully monitored everything that happened there. The soldiers lined up in uniforms, one after another. Their military uniforms had been taken off. Instead, they were dressed in rags. Suddenly, the man gave the order and the whole room burst into flames. The soldiers started burning. It was hard for the women to watch what was happening. They even held back their tears. But the soldiers didn't feel any pain. One by one, they just fell apart. The man was breathing heavily and couldn't take his eyes off the plastic melting from the great heat and temperature. But suddenly, he saw something after which he could no longer stand still. After all, one of the robots, the same one that came in last. He started to smile. Now, being in the ship, the man remembered the events from the time when he was still a soldier. He remembered the smile of that terrible man who said that all the recruits were simply burned. And there were also many rumors that many soldiers were normal and alive, and why they were burned. No one understood. And now he understood the situation that all the robots were burned alive, with smiles on their faces. After that, the girl in the mask looked at him very suspiciously, and it seemed that she knew something more than everyone else. Silence fell in the room. No one dared to speak first. The doctor, who listened attentively to the man, could not believe that people were so cruel and capable of this. The professor could not understand it either. He could not even imagine that in order to achieve his own goal, a person was capable of such a thing. Even to a healthy bandit, this story seemed very sad. Only the woman listened to him and remained serious. Roberto Hoffman seemed very upset. He realized that, most likely, all those deaths were in vain and did not lead to anything. Suddenly, the little boy began to blame him for what had happened, because he could have followed them and saved them. Immediately, the doctor turned her attention to this and looked at the man angrily. But he remained calm all the time and seemed to try not to show his emotions. Instead, he praised the boy for making the right conclusion and noticing this. And when he stroked him, the woman did not take her eyes off him and looked at him all the time. And at that moment, the man admitted that he had been training robots all the time and watching them being killed. The doctor woman thought about his words and what was happening. The old professor also became sad and lowered his eyes. He did not speak anymore and was just silent all the time. A dead silence fell in the room. It seemed that all the people finally understood what evil was really happening. And the healthy Negro began to laugh because he thought that his son was a genius. After his words, he seemed to be pleased. Suddenly, the leader broke the silence. She knew that the main character had lost his son. Suddenly, he looked at her sharply, and it seemed that this question surprised him very much. He looked at the old professor because he realized that it was he who told about what happened. He was the only one who could do it. However, there was hope that he was still alive, so she agreed to help find him, wherever he was. The main character seemed not to trust her, however. He had no other choice, and he nodded in agreement. They were about to leave, leaving the people to rest. After the battle, they were tired, so they needed time. They also left the man a portion of whale meat that belonged to him for him to eat. Seeing a portion of his meat on the table, he thanked and was about to eat it. The door closed, and they were left alone in the room. The main character did not know what to do next, and could he trust these people? He looked at the meat. It was not appetizing, however. He had no other choice, so he had to eat in order to restore his strength. He looked at it for a long time, but he had no appetite. It looked terrible, but his stomach was rumbling. He knew he was hungry and had to eat at least a small piece. The professor convinced him that it was really necessary and he had to do it. Therefore, he took the meat and asked how the old man managed to survive in that meat grinder they had fallen into. The old man began to scratch his head and seemed not to want to answer. However, in the end, he dared to apologize and seemed to be going to confess what he had done. He replied that when it all started, he was too scared and could not control himself. Therefore, seizing the moment, he simply ran away in order to save his life, for which he was now very ashamed. Meanwhile, Roberto Hoffman began to eat, and as soon as he took a piece of meat in his mouth, he almost started vomiting. He tried to restrain himself and ran to the toilet with all his might. The man had never tasted anything worse in his life and could not believe that it was even possible to eat it. He felt bad and started vomiting. Behind him, the professor stood and wanted to help. He asked if everything was okay, but in response, he only heard that the meat spoiled very quickly, and the man vomited and finally felt relieved. Was he just hungry and all this happened to him because he had been unconscious for 3 days? The professor also believed that it happened because he had not even drunk water and started eating very suddenly. The man tried to get up, but he continued to shake. The man had to hold him so that he would not simply fall off his feet. Roberto Hoffman wanted to breathe fresh air and ordered him to stay so that he could look after his daughter. The old man listened to him and assured him that he would look after her while he was gone. Roberto Hoffman thanked him and went to the door, preparing to leave the room. The professor looked at him and understood that this did not look like poisoning. There was definitely something wrong with Roberto Hoffman. A man found himself in the corridor of a ship. He didn't have time to reach the deck. He felt sick again and started vomiting. Right in the corridor, he stood, leaning against the wall and trying to come to his senses. He was not getting better, however. He wiped the sweat from his face and tried to hold on. He felt very bad. He was haunted by constant fatigue, vomiting, headache, and much more. His body was shaking. It seemed that he even had a fever, however. He tried to hold on and not fall off his feet. Suddenly, he heard some incomprehensible sounds that reminded him of growling. It seemed that this sound reminded him of the work of a chainsaw, so Roberto Hoffman stopped and looked behind him. There was a sound coming from the corridor, however, he did not see anything suspicious. The sound seemed to come from the room where he had been before, and the thought that someone else might be there now haunted him. Therefore, despite his poor condition, he turned around and decided to check what was really happening. Roberto Hoffman began to look for the same room because he did not remember where it was located. The only thing left for him to do was to orient himself to the sound. When he got closer, he heard sounds that reminded him of chewing. It seemed that people were eating something. Now, he was definitely convinced that it was not what he had imagined and that, in fact, people were eating something. He began to get closer and remembered the same woman who had eaten a piece of meat a few days ago. Then, she was very weak and almost fell off her feet. But now she was dead and lying on the ground. Hungry people cut her body into pieces and began to eat piece by piece. Their hands and faces were covered in blood. From hunger, people went crazy and turned into cannibals. The Negro turned around and saw the main character. He realized that he had been noticed. Roberto Hoffman realized that these people were seriously against him, so he began to tremble from what he saw. In the craws of people, there were pieces of meat that they ate raw. They chewed it and stuffed it. However, they realized that the main character had become an unwanted witness, and he did not need to see this. The Negro stood up, and it was clear that he was angry. Wiping his face with his hand, he began to threaten the man. However, this did not scare Roberto Hoffman, and he tried to find out why they did it. The Negro did not hide what was happening and directly said that they were just eating. Therefore, this meant that they were cannibals who ate their own comrades when they began to weaken. These words really hurt the man, so he stood up to his full height and approached Roberto Hoffman. He again began to wipe the blood and pieces of meat from his face. After that, he looked the main character straight in the eyes again. He asked what difference it made to him and what was he trying to do now. Roberto Hoffman found himself in a difficult and very tense situation. He realized that now he would not be let out of here so easily, because he saw something that he, most likely, was not supposed to see. The enemies began to surround him and were going to attack at the most opportune moment. However, Roberto Hoffman did not wait for them to attack him, and himself struck his enemy directly in the head. After that, he struck the man who was behind him and was going to attack from the back. He was an experienced soldier and fought with all his might against a larger number of enemies. Despite his weak condition, the enemies understood that it was not so easy to defeat the man, so they took up arms. Another fat man took a chainsaw and was going to cut him into pieces. Roberto Hoffman understood that he was surrounded, and now he needed to decide what to do next. Fire was opened on him, but he managed to dodge the bullets. They only slightly grazed his shoulder. This allowed him to get close to his enemy, and now he was ready to hit him. He lowered his weapon to prevent him from firing again. With his machine gun, he started shooting at the bandits with the chainsaw and hit him in the arm. He fell, and now he was also no threat to him. But he did not relax and looked around so that he would not be surrounded again and hit from behind. Next to him, he saw a terrible monster that was not suitable for a person. It seemed that his skin had sharp spikes and was very thick, so defeating him would not be so easy. It was a Negro who had transformed into a zombie and was now going to kill him and strike. The monster grabbed the main character right by the face and lifted him above him, not giving him the opportunity to free himself and escape. The monster pressed him against the wall and did not give him the opportunity to even move. It seemed that he wanted to crush his head. However, the man did not give up. He tried to resist and strained all his muscles in order to survive and get out. But he understood that the monster was much stronger and it was not so easy to escape. For several long minutes, he tried to resist and fought with the monster that wanted to kill him. He began to shoot from a machine gun, however. It did not help him and did not even injure the mutant. With trembling hands, he put the machine gun to his chest and waited for the right moment to try to kill him. He was in a lot of pain. It seemed that every part of his body was about to burst. However, all this time he tried to endure. He continued to fight. His enemy retreated, and at that moment, he saw in front of him. Kaimaru wanted to stop it, but the monster did not understand why she was going to save the life of the enemy. He seemed to look confused because he thought that the death of the main character could not be avoided. Kaimaru warned that they should be careful when they cut up the bodies because many people in their place also could not resist hunger and eat a piece. The main character couldn't believe that she was talking seriously now and pointed the gun at her. And suddenly, he fired a shot, but unexpectedly, Kaimaru was ahead of him. She approached him and grabbed the barrel. With a creak, she bent it, and now he won't be able to make a single shot anymore. The weapon remained in her hands, and the main character simply jumped back. Everyone understood that the main character knew everything and saw something that no one was supposed to see. Now, they decided what to do with him. They wanted to kill him because they were afraid that other people might find out about this secret. She started talking first and warned that sometimes people behaved too aggressively. Suddenly, she also turned into a mutant, and it seemed that her abilities were much stronger than Kuchuk's. The main character began to retreat and realized that there was no way he could defeat them all while remaining human. However, he did not understand how he managed to become such a strong monster last time. But he did not have time to think, because he had to defend himself and restrain the attacks of the mutants, who began to attack him one after another. He felt that his enemies were very strong, and fighting them was not as easy as he imagined. But after waiting for the right moment, he had to counterattack his enemy. However, this was not enough. At that very moment, she pounced on him again. She struck a strong blow to his weak spot, his chest. The man felt his ribs start to crack. Kaimaru stood in front of him. It seemed like she was going to kill him, but she didn't do it and let him live. Suddenly, she asked if he was hungry. This question confused him. However, she meant his portion of whale meat, which was lying in the corridor. Why didn't the man eat what was his? Wasn't he hungry, or did he just not like it? He was silent, so she continued to ask. She was curious about what he really thought about this place. Roberto Hoffman again didn't understand what she meant and asked again. As it turned out, he was now in their personal restaurant, which was covered in blood. And now, he realized that this was a place where people were simply eaten and their bodies were cut into pieces. Looking around him, he saw only blood, meat, and body parts that belonged to people. Understanding came too late. He began to breathe heavily and anger overwhelmed him. He could not believe that people were capable of such terrible crimes. It was a real hell on earth. One could only guess how many people became victims of this terrible death camp. Suddenly, he drew attention to the dead man's hand. There was a ring on it, and it seemed he recognized it. Roberto Hoffman looked for a long time and thought about where he could have seen it before. The woman asked him again if he was still hungry and had not changed his mind. She knew that sooner or later he would no longer be able to tolerate this feeling and would be forced to eat. Roberto Hoffman also understood this, but was not going to obey her. The woman began to approach him and told him that this was their special human farm. Enemies began to surround him, and steam began to come from the main character. Suddenly, the main character, from the stress he had experienced, turned into a mutant with a monster hand again. He was ready to fight and destroy everyone. He growled. Steam continued to come out of him. The man was angry and ready to die, but not to give up. The enemies who were watching him realized that he had transformed very quickly. In addition, they noticed that his hand had completely completed the mutation and was not the same as it was 3 days ago. But they could find out only after fighting him now, while it was difficult to make any assumptions. Roberto Hoffman understood that he had enemies in front of him, and if they were not stopped, they would soon eat all the people on the ship. They fooled people and pretended to be normal, but now he was no longer going to tolerate this. Gritting his teeth, he rushed to attack. However, he managed to dodge his first blow. He continued to fight, and now he was able to injure the black monster. A deep wound and blood appeared on his body. He was not going to let him go so easily because he was going to finish him off. The woman understood that she could lose her ally, so she began to approach him from behind. His blows were really very strong and fast. Besides, the woman was surprised that his monster was so strong, and the transformation was so successful. However, she was also fast. Kaimaru approached and grabbed his leg. The main character was on the ground. He did not understand how this happened, but now she was standing in front of him, and the man was very vulnerable to her attacks. And suddenly, she struck a strong blow with her foot, from which he flew back. He hit the wall painfully and could not understand how this could happen because he was not ready. However, despite the pain and fatigue, the man began to get up and tried to recover in order to continue fighting. At this moment, an opponent approached him, who hit him with incredible force and continued to strike even more blows. But while he was fighting with him, the woman did not stand aside and was about to hit him. He began to retreat and tried to block her blows, but she wounded him and cut his face. But he managed to block most of the blows with his own mutated hand. The knife with which she tried to injure him could not harm him. But suddenly, Kuchak, who also attacked him, dealt a much more serious blow. His fighting style was already remembered by the enemies, so now they could easily resist him. But even so, he remained very strong, and it was difficult for the cannibals to fight him. They did not understand why, being hungry and exhausted, he was so strong and fought so bravely. It remained only to wait for Roberto Hoffman to lose his vigilance, and when it seemed so, the enemy approached him in a close-quarters position. Now, the man was open, so the enemy was going to take advantage of this and deliver a strong and powerful blow. She stuck the knife straight into his chest, but noticed that he was still alive. His eyes turned black, which meant that what she had seen on the deck before could happen again. She was afraid that a strong explosion could happen again, and the blast wave would swallow her. She took the knife out of his chest. She understood that now he felt anxiety or fear, because gases were coming out of his body again. His wound hurt. He silently looked at it and endured. She knew that now he was in a lot of pain because the blood was no longer distributed evenly throughout his body. Suddenly, an old professor appeared in the room who had come to the sounds of the battle. He opened fire, trying to save the main character. He asked if the man was okay because he had come here immediately after he himself heard the sounds of machine gun shots. Barely breathing, he ordered him to take his own daughter and escape from this part of the ship. She needed to be saved. Suddenly, she also entered inside. Safe and sound, she held a weapon in her hands and seemed ready to fight for her father. The girl looked at the enemies who surrounded him from under the forehead and was going to do everything possible to try to save her father. Roberto Hoffman could not believe his own eyes and began to shout at her. The enemies looked at her and understood that she was able to wake up on her own, and now they did not need to wake her up. And suddenly she started shooting, trying to wound them. The professor also opened fire with a pistol, but it seemed to have no effect. The monster's thick skin could not be penetrated by ordinary bullets. They simply remained standing in the same place. Ara was able to get close to her own father. She stood in front of him and covered him with her body. Her eyes turned red. She promised herself that she would kill anyone who dared to harm her family. The enemies realized that her eyes were partially modified, so they decided to end it there. A bright flash appeared in the middle of the room. Suddenly, someone entered the room. They were unknown people. It was a doctor, along with other people. She asked everyone to stop and stop killing each other. The old man was not going to stop. He opened fire and did everything in his power to contain the blow. She turned to the girl and her father and asked them never to kill each other again. The doctor began to explain that they only ate people who could not be saved. That is, they were sick or wounded. She explained that the girl they ate was very sick and did not even speak in the last days of her life. Suddenly, far away in the corridor, they heard the sounds of shots again. Everyone turned sharply to check what was happening and who started shooting. As it turned out, it was a man of not very tall height with tattoos. Behind him were armed soldiers, and he himself had a weapon. He burst inside, and the soldiers behind him were real giants and looked very dangerous. He managed to injure a man who was standing in the corridor and making sure that no strangers entered. The chief's name was Russell, and the soldiers informed him that there were people inside. He laughed because he sincerely believed that all the people in this part of the ship had already become a snack for zombies. The doctor rushed to the wounded man and he began to ask who they were and what they were doing in this part of the ship. The main character stood together with his friends and could not understand what was happening. It seemed that his enemies had now become allies for him, and now they would have to fight together against a common enemy. Russell began to go inside the room and pushed aside the people standing in the doorway. Now everyone finally saw who was in front of them and who initiated the shots. The new enemy lowered his head and looked carefully at everyone who was inside the room and standing in front of him. And he also witnessed what was happening. On the table, he saw the body of a woman who was being eaten piece by piece. Kaimaru understood that now they were in trouble because a dangerous enemy, whom everyone knew, had become a witness to what was happening. But the main character did not yet realize how serious everything was. Everyone who surrounded him was an enemy to him, so he was focused. Russell smiled. He realized that before him were half-zombies mutants, and he thought that such people had long since died out. Now, they were all in Zone A, and he had never seen living people here before, so they were the first he met. It seemed that the mutant woman had never heard of this zone before, and in general, she did not know that the ship was divided into zones. Now, it became clear that they were all in this man's territory. He was the one in charge here. Suddenly, the sounds of shots were heard again. Russell did not understand what was happening. He turned to see who it was. Ara raised her weapon and was about to shoot as well. However, he began to speak and tried to calm her down. The man insisted that there had been a misunderstanding and that he really didn't want his soldiers to open fire. Kuchak tried to calm the people down and wanted them all to calmly leave this area of the ship and leave the bandits' territory. However, the people didn't listen. At that moment, Russell began to smile. His eyes lit up. He smelled blood. He laughed again. This time, he was going to warn them of the consequences, because he never dared to be on his territory without his knowledge. Therefore, the Whig ordered his soldiers to take all the people prisoner and simply kill those who resisted. The man ordered his soldiers to turn around and close the door. He wanted all the people inside to be prisoners and unable to get out. The soldiers followed his order and did everything as he asked, and the people were so scared of what was happening that they didn't even try to resist. The doctor who was in the corridor was in danger. Everyone heard her scream because next to her, there were soldiers who were ready to kill her. Finally, all the people inside the room realized that their situation was difficult. They became prisoners who couldn't even defend themselves. The woman also understood everything. In front of her was a real scoundrel who needed to be stopped because he was seriously going to kill them all. In his hands was a capsule with an incomprehensible substance, which he took out and showed to people. It seemed that it was a bullet that he was going to use. Russell was very determined. He would never let anyone get out of here alive. The monster began to throw at him and called him a rooster. However, he did not even panic and seemed to have been ready for such a turn of events from the very beginning. The professor watched what was happening and understood that something was definitely wrong. After all, Russell remained very calm even after seeing the half-zombie in front of him. This meant that he was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. The man realized that he was not afraid of them at all, which meant that there were people who had the same abilities, and he had met them before. Russell knew exactly how to defeat them because his weapons were not that powerful, and the army was so large. At this moment, Kuchak tried to strike and attack the enemy, but he grabbed it by the horns and stopped the attack with one hand. Russell was not going to retreat, and it seemed that the strength of the monster meant nothing to him. Kuchak realized that he had underestimated him because the guy in front of him was much stronger than he looked. He hit him, after which he immediately jumped back so as not to expose himself to danger and not to remain in the line of attack. Everyone watched what was happening and saw that the mutant's shell was split by the guy's blow. From the pain, Kuchak even bent over. His body began to tremble. He knelt down and stood without moving. His son could not believe his own eyes. The boy considered his father the strongest, but now he saw that he could not defeat a much smaller opponent. After that, Russell was not going to stop. He only smiled and waited for another opponent to try to attack him. He pushed the mutant away and he fell to the ground. People watching what was happening couldn't believe that such a strong monster could be defeated so easily. Moreover, he was defeated not by the same monster, but by an ordinary guy who didn't fire a single shot. So the enemy was really very dangerous. His son was trembling with fear. He only hoped that his father was still alive and would soon be able to come to his senses. He shouted to him, but his father didn't react. He lay on the ground, and the people around him looked at him with fear. Kuchak gritted his teeth and endured the pain that pierced his body. However, his jaw was broken, and he didn't feel it. The son realized that he could not help his father in any way because he felt very bad. The enemy stood directly on his chest and began to press with his weight, which made the monster's whole body tremble. He tried to reassure his son that everything was fine and it was a small scratch that would heal soon. At this time, the bleeding did not stop. Suddenly, the enemy kicked him right in the face, hitting the place that hurt him the most. When he realized that the little boy was his son, he smiled because he realized that now he could be used for his own purposes. At that very moment, the main character realized that the situation was critical and they could not delay. Something had to be done. Russell began to threaten the boy. He wanted the little boy to come to him so that he could take him prisoner and kill him. From fear, he began to tremble and could not even move.